In the summer of 1789, people woke up to find their city on fire. Not from bombs or invading armies, from rage. Ordinary people, bakers, shopkeepers, mothers, and blacksmiths, picked up whatever weapons they could find. Kitchen knives, farming tools, muskets stolen from guard posts. They marched through the streets of Paris, their faces twisted with fury and desperation. They stormed a fortress, killed its guards, and paraded through the city carrying severed heads on pikes like trophies. Within weeks, the entire social order of France, one of the most powerful nations on earth, collapsed. Peasants burned down the homes of nobles. Priests were dragged from churches and murdered in the streets. Ancient laws were torn up and thrown into bonfires. The king, once considered chosen by God himself, was locked in a palace and treated like a prisoner. And across France, a single terrifying question echoed. What happens when the people decide they don't need kings anymore? What no one understood at the time was that they were witnessing the birth of something entirely new, a revolution that would execute a king, drown a nation in blood, and change the world forever. This was the French Revolution, and once it started, there was no turning back. To understand why France exploded, we need to understand what it looked like before the fire. In 1780s France, society was divided into three rigid groups called estates. Think of them as three different levels of a building, and you were born on one floor with no elevator to take you anywhere else. The first estate was the clergy, the Catholic Church. Priests, bishops, and abbots. They owned about 10% of all the land in France. They paid no taxes, none. They collected taxes from everyone else through something called the tithe, a mandatory donation that was supposed to go to charity, but mostly went to building bigger churches and funding lavish lifestyles for bishops. The second estate was the nobility, dukes, counts, barons, people with titles passed down through their bloodlines. They owned another 25% of France's land. They also paid almost no taxes. Instead, they collected feudal dues from peasants who lived on their land. Even better, they had the exclusive right to hunt on their estates, meaning if you were a starving peasant and you killed a rabbit to feed your family, you could be hanged for it. Then there was the third estate, everyone else. 98% of France's population. Merchants, lawyers, doctors, skilled workers, and, most of all, peasants. These were the people who worked the fields, baked the bread, built the roads, and paid all the taxes. Let that sink in. 2% of the population paid nothing. 98% paid everything. At the very top of this pyramid sat King Louis XVI. He wasn't a tyrant. He wasn't even particularly cruel. Louis was, by most accounts, a genuinely kind man who loved making locks as a hobby. The problem was that he was weak, indecisive. He inherited a broken system and had no idea how to fix it. His wife, Marie Antoinette, became the most hated woman in France. Austrian by birth, she was seen as a foreign intruder in the French court. Rumors spread, most of them false, that she spent fortunes on jewelry and dresses while people starved. She never actually said, "Let them eat cake," but it didn't matter. The people believed she did, and belief is more powerful than truth. The French government was drowning in debt. Why? Wars. France had just spent a fortune helping America win its independence from Britain. It sounded noble, but the bill was astronomical. The French treasury was empty. The solution? More taxes. But the nobles and clergy refused to pay, so the burden fell, once again, on the third estate. And then, nature itself turned against France. The winter of 1788 was brutal, the coldest in living memory. Crops failed, rivers froze solid. The price of bread, the staple food that made up 50% of a commoner's diet, doubled, then tripled. People were starving. Women stood in bread lines for hours only to find the bakeries empty. When you're watching your children go hungry while nobles throw lavish parties in palaces, something breaks inside you. The system wasn't just unfair anymore, it was unbearable. In May 1789, King Louis made a desperate move. He called a meeting of the Estates General, a massive assembly of representatives from all three estates. It hadn't been convened in 175 years. Louis hoped this meeting would solve France's financial crisis. Instead, it lit the fuse. Here's why. Each estate got one vote. Sounds fair, right? It wasn't. The first and second estates, clergy and nobles, always voted together to protect their privileges. That meant the third estate, representing 98% of the population, was always outvoted 2-1. The third estate said, no more. They demanded voting by head, meaning each individual representative got a vote, not each estate. The king refused. So the Third Estate did something revolutionary. They walked out. On June 20th, 1789, they gathered in a nearby tennis court and took an oath. They swore they would not leave until they had written a new constitution for France. This was open rebellion. They declared themselves the National Assembly, the true voice of the French people. Louis panicked. He ordered troops to surround Paris. To the people, this looked like the king preparing to crush them by force. Fear turned to fury. On July 14th, 1789, a mob of Parisians marched to the Bastille, a medieval fortress used as a prison and symbol of royal tyranny. They demanded weapons stored inside. The governor refused. The mob attacked. After hours of fighting, the fortress fell. The governor was dragged into the street. Someone cut off his head with a pocket knife and stuck it on a pike. The crowd paraded it through Paris like a victory banner. The Bastille, a symbol of absolute royal power, was demolished stone by stone. This wasn't a political protest. This was a declaration of war. The violence spread like wildfire. In the countryside, rumors flew that nobles were hiring bandits to slaughter peasants. This sparked the Great Fear, a mass panic where peasants armed themselves and attacked the estates of their landlords. They burned chateaux, destroyed feudal records that documented their debts and obligations, and in some cases, murdered nobles who tried to stop them. The National Assembly, trying to restore order, abolished feudalism overnight. On August 4th, 1789, noble after noble stood up and renounced their privileges. It looked noble, but it was survival instinct. The alternative was being torn apart by an angry mob. 1 month later, the Assembly issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. It declared that all men were born free and equal. That power came not from God or kings, but from the people. It was one of the most radical documents ever written. It was also a death sentence for the old world. But the king still had power. So the people decided to take it away. On October 5th, 1789, thousands of women, furious over bread shortages, marched 12 miles from Paris to the Palace of Versailles. They carried pikes, muskets, and kitchen knives. They broke into the palace, killed 2 royal guards, and nearly reached the queen's bedroom before she escaped. They forced the king and his family to return to Paris, where they could be watched. Louis XVI, the King of France, was now a hostage in his own capital. For 2 years, there was an uneasy balance. The king pretended to go along with the new constitution. The revolutionaries pretended to believe him. But everyone knew it couldn't last. In June 1791, Louis tried to escape. He and his family disguised themselves and fled in the middle of the night, heading for the Austrian border where Marie Antoinette's family could protect them. They almost made it. But they were recognized in a small town called Varennes and dragged back to Paris in humiliation. That was the moment trust died. If the king tried to run once, he'd try again, and if he reached Austria, he'd return with an army. By 1792, France was at war with Austria and Prussia. Foreign armies invaded France to restore the monarchy. The revolutionaries responded by getting more radical. A new group, the Jacobins, seized control. They were led by a lawyer named Maximilien Robespierre, a man who believed that virtue must be enforced, if necessary, through violence. In August 1792, a mob stormed the king's palace. Louis was arrested. The monarchy was abolished. France was now a republic. And then came the question no one had dared ask. What do we do with the king? Louis XVI was put on trial for treason. The evidence was damning. Letters showing he'd been secretly communicating with foreign enemies. On January 21st, 1793, he was led to the guillotine in the Place de la Révolution. A massive crowd watched in silence as the blade fell. For the first time in over 1,000 years, France had no king. The execution sent shockwaves across Europe. Every monarch on the continent now feared the same fate. They banded together to crush the French Republic. But instead of collapsing, France fought back with terrifying intensity. And then, the revolution began eating its own children. Robespierre and the Jacobins launched the Reign of Terror. Their logic was simple. The revolution had enemies everywhere. Royalists, foreign spies, traitors. To save the revolution, they had to be eliminated. Fast. Revolutionary tribunals were set up across France. Trials lasted minutes. There was no real defense. If you were accused, you were guilty. The punishment was always the same: death by guillotine. The guillotine became the symbol of the revolution. Efficient, democratic. It killed nobles and commoners with equal speed. Every day, Crowds gathered in the Place de la Révolution to watch heads roll into baskets. It became entertainment. Marie Antoinette was executed in October 1793. Prominent revolutionaries who disagreed with Robespierre, people who had helped start the revolution, were guillotined as traitors. Georges Danton, one of the revolution's early heroes, was beheaded. Before he died, he said, "Show my head to the people. It's worth seeing." In 10 months, the Reign of Terror killed at least 17,000 people officially. Tens of thousands more died in mass drownings, shootings, and brutal reprisals in rebel regions like the Vendée, where entire villages were burned to the ground. The revolution had become what it set out to destroy, a system built on fear, where questioning authority meant death. Finally, even Robespierre's allies had enough. On July 27, 1794, he was arrested. The next day, he was guillotined. The crowd erupted in cheers. The terror was over. But so was the dream. When the smoke cleared, France was exhausted. The revolution had devoured the monarchy, the nobility, the church, and then itself. Hundreds of thousands were dead. The economy was in ruins. The government was a revolving door of weak leaders. France was still at war with most of Europe. The people were desperate for stability, for order, for someone strong enough to end the chaos. In 1799, a young general named Napoleon Bonaparte seized power in a coup. He promised to preserve the revolution's ideals while restoring order. Within 5 years, he crowned himself Emperor of France. The revolution had come full circle. It began by killing a king and ended by creating an emperor. But here's the twist. The revolution didn't fail. Yes, it was bloody. Yes, it spiraled out of control. Yes, it ended with a dictator. But it permanently shattered the old world. The idea that kings ruled by divine right, that some people were born superior to others, was dead. The French Revolution unleashed ideas that could never be put back in the box. Liberty, equality, the sovereignty of the people. These ideas spread like wildfire across Europe and eventually the world. Every revolution that followed, 1848, 1917, the American Civil Rights Movement, traced its roots back to France in 1789. The revolution also showed the dark side of radical change. When you tear down an entire system with no plan for what comes next, violence fills the vacuum. When you divide people into us and them, and brand anyone who disagrees as an enemy, you create the conditions for terror. The guillotine wasn't just a tool of execution, it was a warning, a reminder that revolutions, once started, are almost impossible to control. So what changed? Everything and nothing. The modern world we live in, with its democracies, its constitutions, its insistence that all people are created equal, was born in the streets of Paris. But so was political terror, so was mass mobilization, so was the idea that violence is acceptable if it serves the greater good. The French Revolution taught us that people will only tolerate injustice for so long. When the gap between the rich and the poor becomes unbearable, when the powerful ignore the suffering of ordinary people, when the system feels rigged beyond repair, something will break. And when it breaks, no one can predict what comes next. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The conditions that sparked the French Revolution aren't ancient history. Massive wealth inequality? Still here. A sense that the system is rigged in favor of the elite? Still here. Ordinary people feeling ignored, exploited, and powerless? Still here. We like to think we've moved beyond the chaos of 1789, that we're too civilized, too rational, too modern for that kind of violence. But revolutions don't announce themselves. They don't send invitations. They brew silently until the moment they explode. The French Revolution was a test of civilization. It asked, what happens when people lose faith in the system? When compromise feels impossible? When rage becomes stronger than fear? History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And that's the most terrifying lesson of all. Anyways, we're watching the past so we can understand the present. And together, we keep history reborn. I'll see you in the next era.